Where we left off from last week, we finished the doctor's opinion. So we are now on page 1 in the Arabic numbers, which is Bill's story. And before we get into that, want to kind of make a couple of comments on some of the stuff that was in the readings this morning, because people who are new or maybe new to this meeting may have heard some things that contradict or don't make sense compared to what they may have heard at AA meetings over the years or whatnot. One thing that was mentioned, and it just struck me this morning, we read it at every one of our meetings. It says, this meeting, there will be no signing of papers and no chips passed out. Now, anybody heard of that at another AA meeting where they don't sign papers from courts, or they don't hand out the chips? Who's got 30 days? Who's got 60 days? So why would we be doing what we're doing? Why would we be doing something different? There's lots of things that we may do a little different here than in some of the other meetings. You may have also noticed that we opened up the meeting. How do we normally open up AA meetings? People who have been to them before, they generally use the serenity prayer, right? Mm-hmm. And we're pulling some prayer out of the book, which many might not even be familiar with. Why is that? Why are we doing all this stuff different? Are we different? Well, kind of want to clarify what we're doing and why we do it. And this is not based on opinion. I'm going to show you everything fact out of this book. First thing is why don't we just take a couple minutes here and let's look at what is an AA meeting supposed to be to begin with, right? The authors wrote this book in 1939. That's where the name Alcoholics Anonymous, in which the meeting that we're at, this book came out, and it's entitled Alcoholics Anonymous. The book came out before there were meetings, before there was a fellowship even called Alcoholics Anonymous. They took the name for the fellowship from the book that they wrote. That's interesting. I always thought it was backwards. I thought they had their meetings and they say, hey, let's write. No, the book came first. So let's look and see what they got to say here, because this is the earliest, these are the earliest records that we have to tell us everything about Alcoholics Anonymous, what it's about. And if you will flip to page 159, and go to the bottom of the page, the last paragraph. Now, if you heard it in the opening remarks, it was stated that when this book was written, there was a little more than 100 men and women. That's who authored the book. It's not authored by one person. It's authored by more than 100 men and women. It went through 100 people before this thing got published to get their combined experience, to make sure they were all in agreement with what we got going on here. So to put that time frame into perspective, that's when there was 100. On the last paragraph on 159, it says, a year and 6 months later, these 3 had succeeded with 7 more. So how many people do we have in AA at that point? 10. 7 and 3. We got 10, but there's Bill that's not mentioned there. So it's actually 11. Way before this book was written. Way before anybody ever heard the name Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay, this is very early on. And it says that seeing much of each other, scarce an evening passed that someone's home did not shelter a little gathering of men and women happy in their release and constantly thinking how they might present their discovery to some newcomer. If you have your own book, I would highly recommend you underlining where it says a little gathering of men and women happy in their release and constantly thinking how they might present their discovery to some newcomer, because that there's their definition, their explanation, their description of what an AA meeting is. Because they said scarce an evening's passed that someone's home didn't shelter this deal, this little gathering. So they were having these meetings, very informal meetings. And so now if we look at that explanation of what their meeting looked like, what it was about and what they were doing, let's look at that carefully. And I would compare this with maybe other meetings you may have been to, because this is, if you want to authenticate whether you're in an AA meeting or not, see if this is what you see going on there, because this is what meetings were all about. You need to look around, see if it looks like you got a little gathering of men and women. Generally, you can check that one off. There's usually men and women at meetings. But here's the key. Are they happy in their release? Notice they're not saying happy to be sober. They're happy in their release. Okay, so basically, when I look around this room, do I see people who seem to be happy? Or does it look like a bar room? Right? Do they look to be happy? Check that one out. And here's the biggest key. Does it look like what they're doing at that meeting, these people who are happy, does it look like they're constantly thinking how they can't present their discovery to a newcomer like me? Or are they off in their own little cliques and gatherings together and talking? Or are they, does it look like they're interested in me and showing me what is their discovery? A discovery is defined as something that's experienced for the first time. What did they discover? They discovered how to recover. In fact, we thought that's what this book is when we read the title page, right? What is Alcoholics Anonymous? The story of how many thousands of men and women had recovered. That's all AA is. It's how we recovered. So when you're walking into a meeting, are people coming up to you if you're new and saying, hey, you know what, do you got a mentor? Are you interested in what we have? If you are, I can show you what I did, because I used to feel just like you do. Felt exactly the same way, lived exactly the same way. And you know what? I don't feel like that anymore. My life is actually unbelievably good today. And if you're interested, if you haven't found a solution, I'll show you what I did. Is that what you see at a meeting? Because if it's not, I would second guess if you're actually in AA meeting, because that's what they did. That's what we're doing here. Next point I want to bring up, now that we know what an AA meeting is, and we know what Alcoholics Anonymous is, they told us in, I believe the first forward, no, I'm sorry, it's in the preface. They told us that what we have here, this book, right? They told us what type of book it is. They said this is a textbook for our society. Our society is the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. This is the textbook. What do we do with the textbook? If anybody remembers going to school, generally we use a textbook for three things. We're going to study it. We're hopefully going to learn from it. And then we can take action based on what we learn. That's why we have a textbook. That's interesting. They're going to show us how they recovered. And we're going to study, learn, and take action. What are we going to learn? How they recovered. That's all that AA has to offer. In fact, they said that in one of the opening remarks that to show other alcoholics, and then they put it in italics, it says precisely how we recovered. That's the main purpose of the book. We're not just going to show you how we recover, we're going to show you with precision. On the top of page 29, it goes on even more to say, further on, clear-cut directions are given showing how we recovered. We getting this? It's not opinions. It's not many different ways. It's one. It's one story. It's one set of factual accounts of how they recovered. Clear-cut directions are in here for us to study and learn. So that means if we're at an AA meeting and we're constantly thinking how we can't present to you our discovery, the one way that we recovered, which is only in this book, then what are we doing at the meeting? Is it group therapy? Is it opinions? What are we doing? Because I can tell you, I thought for the longest time, you go to meetings, they said, just keep coming back, go to 90 meetings, 90 days, stick with the winners and all this stuff. And kind of what I got out of that is what it meant is just stick around and this is going to rub off on you. Well, I can tell you, it never rubbed off on me. I was able to stay sober for a period of time, but I was never that one key word they said, happy in the release. I didn't understand that because I still wasn't happy. I was miserable, right? So that's what we're going to learn in this book. And so with that, they also told us all we're going to need to recover is what's in the first portion of this book. That's all we're going to need. And that really should clarify and give you a straight, narrow path as to what we need to do to recover. So if somebody tells you at a meeting, well, listen, I've been sober 20 years and you need to start writing a gratitude list every day or some other, there's all sorts of crap. I've heard it since I was 14 years old coming to AA. Believe me, I've heard all of it. And it kept me sick for a long time. And since I've learned what's in this book and started following what's in this book, my vision and understanding of what Alcoholics Anonymous is very, very different. And most importantly, I've bought into it because it worked for me. After 20-something years of bouncing in and out of AA, nothing really works. Stay sober, but miserable. And once you get miserable for so long, why be sober, right? That at least gives me a sense of relief. And actually, if it's given me a sense of relief, doesn't that make alcohol the solution, not the problem? Question is, why am I miserable when I'm sober? That's the problem. So what we're going to learn here is how to recover, not how to get sober and stay sober. It's not what this is about. So when you put all that into perspective, how long somebody's been sober what's the real meaning to that? You know, the idea or the concept always in my mind was going to AA is the longer somebody's sober, the better they are as a person. You know, they've learned and they've grown, they're better. You know, I hear people say, when you get a sponsor, make sure he's got at least 5 years, right? Because that's one of the top guys. Well, I tell you what, when I was sitting around with 16 years, you know, and you're supposed to be one of the top guys, it becomes more difficult for me than it is for a newcomer to come to a meeting and say, you know what, I'm thinking about killing myself because I'm so damn miserable and I've been sober 16 years. We don't say that. We don't talk like that. Newcomer, you can understand that. But this conventional AA, the opinion-based stuff did not work for me. If it works for you, great. Okay, for somebody else, great. What I'm going to present to you is not based on any of my opinion. I do my best not to give my opinion. It's just what's in this book. So when we look at that, that's why we have no chips. They tell us here later, that's a personal issue. You know, who your higher power is, personal issue. We're not here about person. We're here for one thing. Those who have recovered are here to teach those who have not yet found a solution how to recover. Period. End of story. That's all we're here for. That's it. You know, the idea, well, I'm here for me. You're going to learn that that's not the case. I'm not here for me. I'm here for you. That's what I'm here for. And when I started learning things that way, things started making a lot more sense. Signing of papers, we read in the preamble as well as in these traditions, which we don't talk about much here, but we're not allied with any outside enterprise. We're not allied with any organization or institution. I'm signing a paper that's given to us from a court. Isn't that allying us with? We're not allied with that. If somebody else in the group wants to sign your paper, that's fine. But at the table, the chair leader does not do it because that would be against our traditions. That's all. That's all it is. Nothing personal. And then the prayers. Let's go into that. I think most of us probably know that AA is not allied with any religion or any denomination, right? We always pride ourselves on that. It's God as you understand him, whatever that is. Right? It's not my God. It's not any religion. But damn it, make sure we close this meeting with a Christian prayer like the Lord's Prayer. Does that make any sense? Doesn't make any sense. Why would we do that? If we're here to be helpful to all newcomers, how helpful are we being to somebody who might be a Muslim or an atheist and saying, we're going to join hands in a circle and you're going to stand up and you're going to recite the Lord's Prayer, or at least just stand there silently and make yourself uncomfortable. Am I here for me to make me comfortable? Or am I here to try to benefit you? Right? For all those reasons, we don't do that. We usually, again, open a meeting with the serenity prayer. Why don't we do that? I'll tell you, the main reason is that all we need is what's in the first portion of this book. That's what they tell us. That serenity prayer is not in the first portion of this book. Okay, where it came from is debatable. There's opinions, but it didn't come from Alcoholics Anonymous. Therefore, if it's not AA, we're here to learn about AA, right? I don't care how often you might see that prayer or hear that prayer. It is not Alcoholics Anonymous because it's not in this book. So we open with the third step prayer, which is in this book that we opened with, and we close with the 7-step prayer, which is in this book. Don't go into talking about that very often, but I just want, somebody may have heard some of the things in the beginning like I didn't thought, well, why is that? Why? So now you know. Hopefully you understand why we're doing what we do. We follow what's in this book, and that's it. That's it. All right. So with that, that's kind of why we might even be set up differently than a lot of other meetings. This is set up more like a classroom, isn't it? Right? You got one joker up here talking and everybody else listening. But didn't we say that the whole idea here is that we're to teach how we recovered? So if you take a physics class and you sit down for the first day in that class, do they say, okay, who out here wants to take a shot at this and get up here and teach us what you think this is about? I don't do that. If you're going to learn physics and you only got so many weeks to do it, you want somebody who understands what's in the book and can explain it to us. Because see, there's another thing. The book alone, is it sufficient? Well, I'll go back to the physics class. I challenge you. I know I couldn't, but go ahead and buy a physics book and read it all the way through, or maybe a calculus book. If you've never taken calculus, just grab the book and read it through. And I guarantee you everything you need to know to master calculus is in that book, every bit of it. And I challenge you to read through it and see if you can't figure it out. without having an instructor sitting down explaining to you what's in the book. That's exactly how this unfolds. I found reading this book did nothing for me. When I had somebody explain to me what's in this book, it makes a world of difference. So that's why we do what we're doing here. I am happy in my release, and I am constantly sitting here grabbing a notebook even today and making notes, because I'm constantly thinking how I can't present this to you guys to help you understand what we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it. Does that make sense? All right, enough of my babbling. Let's move on to page 1, which is Bill's story. So this, again, page 1 used to be in the first edition that was written in 1939. Page 1 used to be the doctor's opinion. They moved it forward since then. And I think if you guys have been with us the last 4 weeks that we went over the doctor's opinion, you found how critical that information really was in understanding what an alcoholic was, or is, I should say. Okay. So now what we're going to get into is the next 3 chapters, the first 3 numbered chapters and the doctor's opinion. Okay. So with the doctor's opinion, that would be 4 chapters, which means that we have 12 chapters in the book in the first portion. 4 of them. 1/3 of this book to teach us how to recover. We got 12 steps, right? Well, we got 12 chapters. Wouldn't it make sense we have 1 step per chapter? That'd make a lot of sense. That's not how it's written. It's not how this works. The first 4 chapters are all about step 1. And that's kind of crazy, because I always thought all you got to do is go into an AA meeting and say, oh yeah, I'm an alcoholic. I'm powerless over alcohol, whatever that exactly means. I'm powerless over it. So I'm done with step 1. Let's move on. And I can't tell you how many mentors I thought, yeah, well, let's move on. You need, if you're going to admit you're powerless over alcohol, if you're going to follow the directions on page 30 for step 1, there's no directions up here, by the way. The directions aren't here. Which tell us that we have to concede to our innermost self that we're alcoholics. We're going to need to make sure we know what an alcoholic is, not my opinion of what it is, but what are they saying an alcoholic is? That's what these 4 chapters are for us to figure out, so that I can determine if I'm one or not. How can I concede to being something if I don't even know what it actually is? So it starts with the doctor's opinion. The next 3 chapters build upon that. The first chapter we're reading is Bill's story. This is about Bill Wilson, who was AA number 1, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. We're going to learn a little bit about Bill. Ironically, you'd think that, and we learn that, you know, the guys early on were mostly old timers. I always looked at them in my mind as being these guys, things are much different today. These guys, man, they were the bottom of the barrel, right? They've been drinking 50, 60 years. Not the case. Bill only been drinking 17 years before he ended up almost dead. So there's some youth in here too. And we're also going to find, didn't we read in the doctor's opinion the basis of what an alcoholic is? And did it have it was one of the qualifications anything about how old you are? That is never in there. It's 2 questions. Have you ever tried quitting for good? Honestly wanted to, not because the court told you or your wife or whatever, but you honestly wanted to quit for good and found you couldn't. If that's the case, you're probably an alcoholic, period. The second question is, when you start drinking, do you have a little control over the amount you take? Have you ever went out, and we're going to see, this is what this is all based on, is these 2 things. The next 3 chapters are based on this. Have you ever went out and said, I'm only going to have 2 or 3 tonight? So you had a lot of trouble last time. So this time I'm only having 2, maybe 4, but no more than that. Set yourself a limit. And ended up having more than you intended to. And if that's the case, has that been a repeated pattern? And if that's the case, do you ever ask yourself why? You use your willpower to only have 2 or 3. Why do you keep having more than you intend to? The doctor tells us that's a physical allergy that we have. When we put it into our system, we have a craving beyond our mental control for more and more and more. And that doesn't happen to normal people. That only happens to alcoholics. Those are the only 2 questions to determine whether you're an alcoholic in this book. That's it. Doesn't matter how old you are, doesn't matter what you drink, doesn't matter how much you drink, doesn't matter how long you drink. None of that matters, contrary to what you might hear in AA meetings. I remember sitting in many first step tables, and the first thing they talk about, well, I started drinking when I was so-and-so, and then they go on and on about what they lost, and their wife left them, and their dog died, and whatever else, car accident. Like, this qualifies me as an alcoholic. That doesn't qualify crap. You drink long enough, that crap's going to happen, okay? Alcoholic is those 2 things. You ever try quitting and can't? Lose control over the amount you take. Either one of those 2 things is what makes us an alcoholic. So that's what we're going to be basing our discussion on for the next 3 chapters. Good? That's kind of what we learned in the last 4 weeks. I just wanted to cover that. All right. So page 1, This is going to be, we're looking at, again, the book was written in 39. For a time frame here, this is Bill in around 1917, 1918, right at the end of World War I. Bill was in his early 20s at this point. Let's see what we got. It says war fever ran high in the New England town to which we new young officers from Plattsburgh were assigned, and we were flattered when the first citizens took us to their homes, making us feel heroic. Here was love, applause, war, moments sublime with intervals hilarious. I was part of life at last, and in the midst of the excitement, I discovered liquor. I forgot the strong warnings and the prejudices of my people concerning drink. In time, we sailed for over there. I was very lonely and again turned to alcohol. So in the beginning here, he was in the midst of excitement and he discovered alcohol. And now he's very lonely and now he turns to alcohol. Whether he's excited or lonely, he's turning to alcohol. We landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral. Much moved. I'll learn more about what that means, that he was moved. Much moved. I wandered outside, and my attention was caught by a doggerel of an old tombstone. Here lies a Hampshire grenadier who caught his death drinking cold small beer. A good soldier is never forgot, whether he dieth by musket or by pot. And they're not talking about the funny stuff they're smoking. What they're talking about back then is when what they would have is what they would call pots of alcohol. So that's what they're talking about. So he reads it. He says, ominous warning, which I failed to heed. 22, and a veteran of foreign wars, I went home at last. I fancied myself a leader, for had not the men of my battery given me a special token of appreciation. My talent for leadership, I imagined. What I want you to look at as we're reading this, granted, this is from a long time ago, right? So it's easy to say. I tell you, the first time I read this, when you're going to start reading a book, I usually start on page 1. So being an AA for I don't know how long, at some point I decided, well, I should probably read this book, right? Because it's Alcoholics Anonymous. I started reading, I go to page 1, and my God, was it painful getting through Bill's story because it made no sense to me. It sounded like history. It was just so boring and painful. But we're going to find, if you look at this from the perspective of how does Bill think? Because we have a problem with our thinking. And when I started looking at the way Bill's thinking and the way that I was thinking, I could see a whole lot of similarities. So that's what I want you to be looking for. It says, my talent for leadership, I imagine, would place me at the head of vast enterprises, which I would manage to the utmost assurance. It's all about ego, isn't it, at this point? I took a night law course and obtained employment as investigator for a surety company. The drive for success was on. I proved to the world I was important. Anybody ever feel that way? In their youth, the drive for success is on, and I'm going to prove myself to be somebody. My work took me about Wall Street, and little by little, I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but some became very rich. Why not I? I studied economics and business as well as law. Potential alcoholic that I was, I nearly failed my law course. Here's the first consequence we hear that Bill has paid from drinking. He nearly failed his law course. At one of my finals, I was too drunk to think or write. Though my drinking was not yet continuous, it disturbed my wife. Now, the guy almost failed his law course going to law school, right? Almost failed because he was too drunk. And who was concerned? Not Bill, but he did notice his wife was concerned. We had long talks when I would still her forebodings by telling her that men of genius conceive their best projects when drunk, that the most majestic construction of philosophic thought were so derived. By the time I'd completed the course, I knew law was not for me. The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in its grips. Business and financial leaders were my heroes. Out of this alloy of drink and speculation, I commenced to forge the weapon that one day would turn in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. Living modestly, my wife and I saved $1,000. It went into certain securities, then cheap and rather unpopular, but I rightly imagined, again, that they would someday have a great rise. I failed to persuade my broker friends to send me out looking over factories and managements. but my wife and I decided to go anyways. It's an important piece. They describe, if you remember in the doctor's opinion, they talk about Bill being a stockbroker. Bill was never a stockbroker. Bill was one of the first that we know of that was actually a stock speculator. He had the idea what they're talking about here, where he went to some of his broker friends and saying, I know it's the 20s, stock market's booming, right? But when we're putting money into the stock market, we're only going by what the company puts out and says how they're doing. But how do we know that's real, right? How about you guys pay me and I'll go to some of these big companies and I'll talk to their employees and I'll see their floor and I'll see their management and I'll see what they're doing and get a real perspective and write you guys a report. So you have some real information to go by when you're going to be investing in these companies. And you know what they said? Well, I'm making money, Bill. That's crazy. Now that's how it all works. He's one of the first guys that did this, but he couldn't convince them to let him do it. But him and his wife decided to do it anyways on their own. I developed a theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. I discovered many more reasons later on. So we gave up our positions and off we roared on a motorcycle, the sidecar stuffed with a tent, blankets, a change of clothes, and 3 huge volumes of financial reference service. That would be like a Yellow Pages, if you guys remember when there was a Yellow Page. That's where you'd look up companies for people who are too young to know what a Yellow Page was, but that's what it was. They could find out where these companies were. Our friends thought a lunacy commission should be appointed. Perhaps they were right. I'd had some success at speculation, so we had a little money, but we once worked on a farm for a month to avoid drawing on our small capital. That was the last honest manual labor on my part for many a day. We covered the whole eastern United States in a year. And at the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position there and the usage of a large expense account. Sounds like these guys were impressed what Bill came back with, huh? Got himself a position, large expense account, and the exercise of an option brought in more money, leaving us with a profit of several $1,000s for that year. For the next few years, fortune threw money and applause my way. I had arrived. Bill's at the top of his game. My judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. Now, drink was taking an important and exhilarating part of my life. We're watching for this progression with his drinking as well. Now it's an important part of his life, and it's an exhilarating part of his life, right? Bill isn't drinking to overcome his problems. Bill's having the time in his life. He's at the top of his game, and this is just making it more exhilarating. It's just part of what we do, right? Not causing him any problems since he almost failed his law course. There was loud talk in the jazz places uptown. Everyone spent in thousands and chattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I made a host of fair-weathered friends. Here's a symptom number 2 consequence. My drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing all day and almost every night. Here's a progression for Bill. Remonstrances of my friends terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. People started not liking Bill coming around being drunk all the time. So they're starting to separate from him. He's a lone wolf. There were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity, for loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. Okay. From what I understand, from what I've heard, is that Bill did write a book called As Bill Sees It. And as I understand, his wife wrote a book called As Lois Remembers It. And as Lois remembers it, there's some inconsistencies here, but nonetheless. In 1929, I contracted golf fever. We went at once to the country, my wife to applaud, while I started out to overtake Walter Hagen. Liquor caught up with me much faster than I came up behind Walter. I began to be jittery in the morning. Ooh, there's another symptom of progression. Now, again, these are not things to say that you're an alcoholic. I never had that happen to me, okay? But you can see a progression happening here. And the importance in the progression is to see at what point do the consequences reach to where you say, you know what? I'm weighing the risk versus reward. Early on, Bill in his drinking, it was becoming an exhilarating part of his life. Lots of reward. Was there any risk? worst that happened is he almost failed law, but he got out of that. Then he went into Wall Street and he's doing great. There's no problems. So there's no problem with drinking. We're going to watch and see when the consequences get greater and greater, and compare that to yourself. When your consequences got greater and greater, and you got to the point where you said, either, well, I'm going to start controlling the amount that I take because I can't do this blacking out crap and have that happen again, right? Or you just get to the point and say, I'm done. Why would you say either of those things? It's because your consequences got great and you decided it's just not worth it. That is sound thinking. What is not sound thinking is, why did you go back to it? See, the question coming in here for somebody new should not be back to, why can't I stop drinking? The question should really be, why do I start again once I stop? I got everything to lose. Why would I? So that's what we want to see with Bill. Don't mind just jittering. Just at what point would you say, okay, enough's enough? And then do you keep going back to it? Okay. That's the reason that we're looking at this. So the drinking's got serious proportions. Where are we at here? I began to be jittery in the morning. Golf permitted drinking every day and every night. It was fun to crawl around the exclusive course with which had inspired such awe in me as a lad. I acquired the impeccable coat of tan one sees in the well-to-do. The local banker watched me whirl fat checks in and out of his till with amused skepticism. Sound like more ego? Right? Bill's on top of the world. Abruptly, in 1929, hell broke loose on the New York Stock Exchange. After one of those days of inferno, I wobbled from a hotel bar to a brokerage office. Now, if you know, in 1929, that is when the Great Depression started, and it was from this. Lasted a very long time. Darkest point in our history. It was 8 o'clock, 5 hours after the market closed. The ticker still clattered. I was staring at an inch of tape which bore the inscription XYZ32. That's how you would know how well a particular company is doing, is with the number after the name of the company. Well, it was 52 that morning. So it's probably lost about 40% of its value. I was finished, and so were many friends. The papers reported men jumping to their death from towers of high finance, and that disgusted me. I would not jump. I went back to the bar. My friends had dropped several millions since 10 o'clock. So what? Tomorrow is another day. And as I drank, the old fierce determination to win came back. Bill's not done. Bill's not done fighting. He's still got fire in his belly. Next morning, I telephoned a friend in Montreal. He had plenty of money left and thought I had better go to Canada. By the following spring, we were living in our accustomed style. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. No St. Helena for me, but drinking caught up with me again, and my generous friend had to let me go, and this time we stayed broke. There's a good consequence, isn't it? We went to live with my wife's parents. I found a job and lost it as a result of a brawl with a taxi driver. Mercifully, no one could guess that I was to have no real employment for 5 years or hardly draw a sober breath. My wife began to work in a department store, coming home exhausted to find me drunk. I became an unwelcome hanger-on at the brokerage places. But underline this, because this is what usually brings us all around. Liquor ceased to be a luxury now. It became a necessity. That's a must. Bill is now, in time reference, he's in his late 30s. Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3, got to be routine. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I would pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. This went on endlessly, and I began to wake very early in the morning, shaking violently. There's symptom number 4. Wasn't he talking about before? What was it? It was just jittery in the morning. Now what's happening? He's waking in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler full of gin followed by half a dozen bottles of beer would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. For many people go through that where they just couldn't even eat in the morning. I mean, that never happened to me, but nonetheless. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation. And that is the breaking point for us when it comes to step 1 of conceding that we cannot control this idea of being powerless. When I want to quit, I can't. If you still think you can control the situation, that's why I said it doesn't matter what you lose. Because there are people who lose everything and they still think they can control the situation and they die that way. Most alcoholics today, that's still exactly what happens. They still die thinking they can control the situation. We don't know where the breaking point is for each and every one of us. That's why it doesn't matter what you went through. You know, It's just, have you got to the point where you want to quit for good? So then you try and you find you can't. I don't care what happened to bring you to that point. But do you want to quit for good? It's the first thing we always want to know with a newcomer. Does this person want to quit for good? Or does he just want to get the heat off his back and hopefully he can just get things back under control? Right? This is complete hopelessness is what they're talking about. Powerlessness. Hopelessness defined as no possibility of a solution. So he's not there. He thought he could still control the situation. And there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hopes. That happened to me. I got sober and stayed sober for a while. And you know what? Maybe I got control of this deal. But then I always go back. See what happens with Bill. Gradually, things got worse. Well, that's what happened to Bill. Gradually, things got worse. The house was taken over by the mortgage holder. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at a low point of 1932, and I had somehow formed a group to buy. And I was to share generously in the profits. Then I went in a prestigious bender, and that chance vanished. Got this whole deal set up, got people willing to buy into the market, big profit for him, and he goes on a bender, or what we call a spree, defined as unrestricted overindulgence. Started drinking, probably to feel good, and drank more than he intended to, and lost that whole deal as a result. Another consequence. I woke up. This had to be stopped. Now, this is Bill's realization. He didn't even start by saying, I need to control how much I'm drinking. He didn't say that. He went to the next part. He woke up. He said, I saw that I could not take so much as one drink. He knew whenever I start, I go on these freaking benders and I lose control. I have to quit for good. He's using his willpower. So I was through forever. Bill's using his willpower. Before then, I'd written a lot of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did. He honestly wanted to quit for good. He was done. The consequences were too much. Next sentence. Shortly afterward, I came home drunk. There'd been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way and I'd taken it. Was I crazy? I began to wonder, for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that. This is the insanity that comes with every one of us with the first drink we're going to follow up on. So I messed up. How many of you have done this? I quit for good and I went back to it. Damn it. I don't know why, but I'm going to renew my effort. This time I'm going to pay attention and I am done. So he renews his resolve and I tried again. And this time some time passed. And confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. I could laugh at the gin mills. Now I had what it takes. He's got it going on. He's quit. He's sober. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone, and in no time I was beating on the bar asking myself how it happened. How did I end up getting back into this again? Here it is. Why didn't I think of the consequences that I decided I needed to quit? Didn't even come to my mind. That's what happens to us. As the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I would manage better next time, but I might as well get good and drunk then, and I did. We're going to stop there for the day.